Okay, so my timer shows it's about time. So hello, welcome everyone to our presentation. Today we will tell you how you can verify that your Jenkins configuration is flawless and rock solid. But before we start, let us introduce ourselves. Roman, can you start?
Okay, I love programming in Python. I'm doing it so long time now. I also interested in 16-bit old machines like Commodore 64, for example, and also some consoles, optcoins, and so on and so forth, and also emulation. So that probably is referred as a retro. I'm also a die-hard Gentoo user for like 15 years now. What about you, Simon?
Well, I'm just a regular IT geek who chooses Bash as his weapon of choice. I love cats, computer games, and Italian dishes of all sorts. And we both work for OVH, where we are responsible for OpenStack services. We use Jenkins for all automatization of our testing, packaging, and deployment. This presentation is sort of a continuation of the topic we presented last time in Berlin, last November. And there we told you how you can keep Jenkins configuration as code, as files in source code repository. If you missed it, you just can follow this URL to YouTube service, or you can just browse the last summit schedule to find the link to the presentation. Now, for all those that were not there, we will do a short recap with necessary background information.
So, maybe we could start what the Jenkins is. So Jenkins is an open source automation server written in Java. It's very powerful, flexible, have tons of plugins extending its functionality. And it's also easy to install, configurable, and it's widely adopted by many companies.
Okay. And while Jenkins is easy to start, as Roman mentioned, configuring it via graphical web user interface might be not the best option, especially for big teams. So therefore, last time we presented you the 3 extensions that improves that, simplifying how you can keep the configuration of Jenkins in source code repository. These plugins are Jenkins configuration as code, abbreviated as JCasC often. It's for general Jenkins configuration, like size of build queue, credentials, etc. Then there comes the Job DSL plugin, which allows you to define jobs using Groovy language. And finally, there is Pipelines plugin that allows you to specify robust and reusable definitions of job steps.
Moreover, unlike the XML configuration, which isn't very pleasant to interact for humans, Jenkins JCasC configuration, DSL jobs, and pipeline steps are similar to code or R code and or markup languages, so that they are simpler and easier to read, write, or modify. And those might be checked by just like any other programming language. So this is the advantage. We can check the correctness of the syntax from one side and its functionality on the other, so that it might be a similarity for the unit test and functional tests.
Okay, so summarizing all this a bit, once we have all the 3 plugins used and configuration stored in source code repository, we can introduce a regular workflow of changes in configuration, a bit just like you, everyone, hopefully, are doing for regular code. So let's imagine a scenario where someone wants to, for example, adjust the size of build queue in Jenkins. So what it's needed to do, what is needed to be done, is to fetch the source code repository do the change, adjust something, and then push a change for review, just like you do for the code. Then there are the people voting, but also as a compulsory part, there is robot that automatically does the dirty job, so launching the tests and verifying various things. Time passes, eventually the change is merged. So in this case, Jenkins catches that event, fetches the new changes in configuration, and reloads itself. Simple as that. Now let's discuss how we can verify automatically the configuration done with all the three mentioned plugins. So the first one there is Job Pipelines, because it's the simplest to test. Why it's the simplest? Because basically the necessary parser is already built in the Pipelines plugin. You can encounter this parser in three places. One is web user interface, when you modify the job via web UI. There is this text area where you can specify the pipelines steps, and it gives you there hints if something is wrong. Okay, but this one is not very interesting in our case here. The two later are more interesting. One place when you can find the parser is HTTP API. It's available under such endpoint as on the slide. So some base Jenkins URL / pipeline model converter / validate. And what you need to do, you need to push there your file using post method, and you will receive an output saying if it's okay or there is something that needs to be corrected. The last option is using SSH CLI client. There is a command called declarative linter, and simply you send them via standard input the content of a Jenkins pipeline, and also it will tell you it's okay or it's wrong. So let's see some example. Here is an example script you can use to verify the pipelines using this first HTTP API. Basically, all you see on the slide is some wrap that will allow you to configure the call, but the highlighted thing is the most important part, where we are sending, using post method, some Jenkins file. This bracket here means put me here the content of file and send it as Jenkins file field. And we are sending it to this endpoint I mentioned. What was on the previous slide I didn't tell you. There is one drawback of this option, is that it always returns a 200 code status. So you cannot easily tell if something is okay or not, other than just parsing the output. If it's not Jenkins file successfully validated, it means something is wrong. Okay? This drawback does not have the second option, so calling our pipelines parser via SSH. However, it requires you to create additional user with configured SSH key to access Jenkins. Okay? It needs a basic privilege to read the list of jobs, but still you need to do that. Once you have it, you can simply call it like this. So SSH to a specific user to Jenkins host on specific port, and then call the command declarative linter. As a standard input, we give the file, and in this scenario, we can just check the exit status of the command. If it's 0, means everything went fine. If it's non-zero, then there was an error.
Okay, so regarding the verifying Jenkins configuration as a code, they are simply YAML files, so that we could, for example, use this one-liner, which is on this first section. that one. Just to verify if this YAML file is correct, let's say, at least at the YAML point of view. But we could do better, right? So they might be that there is a JSON schema which is generated by the JCasC plugin, so that we can use it against those files, the configuration files, and check it if they are correct or not. So here is a basic script which is written in Python, because we cannot use directly JSON schema executable, which is provided by JSON schema library, because it doesn't accept the YAML files. We should convert them first, so that there is a conversion done here. And also, we are, instead of downloading separately the schema file, we are just using the method getSchema to fetch them from the our Jenkins installation server. So as for the getSchema function, we thought that those 2 lines should be enough. Unfortunately, schema cannot be used directly because of the issues on the generated side of the schema. So there are some 3 main issues about it. So there are not valid reference word for the keyword, which is this thing. I mean, the $ref is the right reference for other schemas inside the schema of the JSON itself. The other one is removing the empty enums, which will be used, for example, for the any-off keyword for the schema. So this is that one. And also, we fixed some bad names which happen to be badly generated. And then we are converting this schema into the dictionary and returned it. Yep. Now let's look at the Job DSL files. So those files are basically Groovy files from the Groovy language. It's basically the extension for this language. So if this is a Groovy language files or code, then we can possibly use the Groovy shell parse method for checking if correctness. So it may detect only basic syntax, unfortunately. It doesn't check, for example, the right amount of the arguments for the function and so on. Fortunately, we might be checked it by providing the unit test, because Groovy language also have unit tests, obviously. And this for sure will give you another layer for the confidency. So here is an example for a parser for the Groovy file. This is actually the main part of it. So we are iterating over the provided files on the command line and trying to parse them. If there is anything wrong with them, then we are printing out the message and also setting the return code to 1. And after this loop will end, then we return it.
Okay, so we know now how to perform static analysis of code, actually of configuration files. But there is a question. Does that ensure us that everything will work correctly? And of course not, as we already mentioned. And as you can see on the picture given on the slide. So for instance, being sure about the correctness of specific words does not prove that the order and meaning in a sentence makes sense, is right. Okay? As for Groovy, as Roman mentioned, simple parsing cannot detect issues like if the number of parameters is correct. It's due to dynamic nature of this language. Unit tests might help partially, especially if you write your own calls so you can check if they are properly called, but not always. So what we can do then? How we can live? Well, the only way to go here appears to be functional testing. And so here we propose a simple deployment procedure for Jenkins, which will ensure you that both JCasC and Job DSL configuration is correct. In big picture, it looks like this. We simply install the Jenkins first with plugins, and then we take care of the configuration. Next, we restart it, so it will start with new settings applied, and then we will launch the seed job that will ensure us the jobs, the defined jobs with Job DSL are correct. Now we will go through all these steps in a bit more detail. So, first step is installation. As Roman already mentioned, Jenkins is very easy to start, as basically as launching a single Java archive. So we can install it manually with some dependencies. However, there is a great Ansible role available already, so it's good to use it, created by Girling guy. And it's very complex. It has many settings. It can do basically everything for us. However, in our case, the simple call to this role after loading some specific variables that will define, for example, ports, etc., it's fully sufficient for us. Then we want to install plugins. And here we a bit exploit the way Jenkins works. What I mean, if you simply download a plugin as a HPI file and you put it in plugins subdirectory, during the start, Jenkins will extract it and will load it. Okay? So here is the job that does what I told you. We basically load the plugin lists defined like in this box here. So list of dicts, plugin names, and version. And then we use the getURL Ansible module to download the file and put it in specific destination. Okay? This way, we have pinned the specific plugins in specific versions in our installation. Next, as a third step, we handle the configuration, and here we rely as much as we can on JCasC. Basically, everything we can configure with it. About the exceptions, Roman will tell in a second. All we need to do is to create a directory where we keep the YAML files JCasC plugin will use. So we create it in first task. Then we copy the actual YAML configuration files after templating them using Ansible template module. And then we modify the Jenkins service file, adding this additional environment variable, basically telling JCasC plugin where to look for configuration files. And that's it.
So, after installation of Jenkins, if you usually install it, on the first run there is a wizard which allows you to set the general settings, and select plugins to install, make some users, and so on and so forth. However, we already have our configuration handled by the JCasC plugin, so we don't need it. We can just mark the initial setup is completed by this Ansible task, and Basically, its role is to just copy it to the specific directory, which is that one, which is init groovyd directory, and place it as a skip setup wizard groovy, which is that script, which actually is setting initial setup completed thing. There are also another things to do, like installing our required tools, secrets, SSH keys, SSL certificates, and so on. And additional things like configuring the firewall or setting up SSH proxy. So in this step, it is done. Also, we are configuring the plugins which not yet are supported by the JCasC. So those one is local plugin and Gerrit trigger. So the all configuration is done. Now it's time to restart the Jenkins to apply the changes. And Ansible service module for that purpose is too simple as shown as the task. So it's name restart Jenkins, and it's a service.
Okay, so what happens now after Jenkins restart? You will know the screen when you browse to the web page. You will encounter such screen like here, basically telling you that Jenkins is loading, preparing to work. Okay? Now you may think how you can detect this phase is finished. Okay? You might think now maybe some output parsing or something. No. Thankfully, the Jenkins creators are very clever people, and they know HTTP protocol. So what's interesting is that during this page appears, there is no 200 HTTP code sent, as you might expect it, but it's actually 503, meaning service unavailable. Okay? So what we have to do is to write such job that will, in a loop with some retrials, will ask for the Jenkins main page, and we wait until we receive HTTP status 200. If we don't get it, then something went wrong. Basically, it will mean that JCasC will fail. And if it's 200, we are sure now that all our JCasC configuration went fine. Everything in Jenkins for the global configuration is correct. So one success. Then about Job DSL. So we need to trigger this so-called seed job. In our case, this is the job that loads all definitions we did in Job DSL and executes it to define all the jobs in Jenkins. We can achieve that by sending a post request to the jobs endpoint /build. Okay? If we will do that, Jenkins will queue the job for execution. Two important things to notice here is that first, it might be required to authenticate or get the CSRF token. We do the second thing. It depends on your configuration. And second thing is that your seed job might require an approval if you use the script security plugin. We use it, but we disable it because our Jenkins dev instance is run in isolated environment, so it's fine. And we can just skip one step. Okay? So we do that. And then we need to wait until this job actually finishes to verify its status. If the job will finish with success, it means that our job DSL definitions are all fine. There were no errors that we didn't catch with simple groovy parsing. Okay? So here we do similar thing like waiting for Jenkins, but we are requesting different endpoint. This time is for our job name. We select the last build and we select the details dictionary through JSON API. Okay? It's convenient in Ansible because when the output of some URL is returned as JSON, it's mapped to variables or fields of object here. So we've got output.json.result, and we compare if it's success or not. If it succeeds, I mean if it finally receives the success status, we know our job DSL deployment went fine. So yeah, that's all we wanted.
So is it enough? Probably not. But look what we have tested so far. So we have validated JCasC configuration. We checked the job description, definitions syntax for, so yeah. And also we have job steps parsed and validated. We also, during the Jenkins deployment, have a functional test for the JCasC, because this is a configuration for the Jenkins, and also have tested definitions, because this is the seed job which was run. So what is missing here? For example, functional test for Jenkins Gerrit integration. We didn't do this yet, but we already have digged into it. So what options do we have? For example, we can spin up the Gerrit server, also like for testing environment, and create then some project and so on and so forth. Or we can just create some like lightweight fake server, which consists an SSH server, which we can, for example, use the Paramiko for it, and also some HTTP servers. So any lightweight framework will do, like Bottle, Pi, or Flask, or whatever. So the idea is to send an appropriate command via Jenkins SSH with right event triggered in Jenkins, and so that we can check if the communication is all right, and all of the events would create appropriate output for either Gerrit and Jenkins. As for the pipeline correctness, pipelines can be reused so that it's good to know that we have them worked as expected in every place.
Okay.
Conclusions.
So finally, we come to conclusions. Now, I would like to point your eyes to this magnificent, lovely cat. And notice how it begs you. Obvious things are obvious, but the tests are important, and this cat wants you to remember that. If you use Jenkins with any of these 3 plugins, please keep in mind how you can verify, how you can automatically test the correctness and make them rock solid. Okay? However, as we mentioned, some things cannot be tested that way. Some things need something more. And the only ultimate way to test some things might be actually to launch even more sophisticated scenario tests, like for example for the Gerrit integration. So if the fortune will be great for us, we might present our achievement on next summit in Shanghai, because as Roman already mentioned, we are already digging into this topic, so we learn a lot about communication between Gerrit and Gerrit trigger. There are some neat things that we might present, but we will see. Okay, that's all what we had for today. Thank you for your attention. And if you like the slides or just found them potentially useful for you, you can just find them on my webpage. Of course, there will be recording from the session, so nothing is lost here. Okay, photos taken. So now I believe we have a few minutes for some questions, comments, suggestions maybe. What do you think? Any questions? Appears obvious things were obvious, so. Okay, so again, we would like to thank you for your attendance.